Half term, you've just had breakfast in the kitchen. Your son or daughter is in a great mood. They're happy, but they're a bit bored because you've got plans to go out later, but have to wait for the plumber because there's a problem in the kitchen with the sink and the water. You are planning to go out in a few hours. The plumber is due in kind of 30, 40 minutes. And then a call comes in and you see it and you go, okay, this is family time. So you don't answer it. It rings straight away afterwards. And this time you kind of, oh, okay, this is unusual. So you pick it up. You discover there's a problem in work, or a friend has called and they are in distress. So you quietly mouth to your son or daughter, excuse me for a minute, I just have to take this, I'll be back in a minute. You go off into another room. It doesn't take a minute, it takes 20 minutes. And when you've come back into the kitchen, you see that your child has decided to do the plumbing to help out because in their mind, this means they could leave earlier. So if you can share in the chat kind of some emotions or thoughts, or how would you be feeling in this scenario? Okay, anger, overwhelmed. Great. Okay, so this actually happened to me, and this picture, the scenario was no way as cute as this kind of picture. And I have to say, my reaction wasn't in response to maybe my retrospective thoughts later on. And I'm going to explain a little bit more in detail what happened and my reaction to that. We're going to look at deconstructing that natural cognitive behavioral process. So what happened in my situation, my natural response, and just understanding where that response came from and potentially what I could have done differently. We're going to identify the steps for reducing those common emotional triggers and learn some practical steps to help you keep your cool in situations such as this. And then we'll end up with a Q&A. So if anybody has ever done NLP or CBT, there is a process called the cognitive cycle, or the thoughts, feelings, and behavior cycle that's very common in these situations. And basically, this is a psychological process that happens in every single person's mind. And it means that for every thought, we will have a feeling, a corresponding feeling. For every feeling we have, we'll have a corresponding thought and a behavior. And for every behavior that we have, because we often don't catch the thought or recognize the feeling, but we will see a behavior, but it is linked. The more we're aware of this cycle, the more chance we have of breaking it. And last week I mentioned about, just very, very briefly, about how an adult lives for most of their time in a process of automation. So we're doing the same things day in and day out just to kind of minimize our thinking. So we'll drive the car without thinking, we'll get up, shower, brush our teeth, make coffee without thinking. And it's very common, and most of us, everybody does it every day. But when it happens in a situation where it could be damaging to the environment around you. So let's say if you are a leader in a leadership role in work, and you lose your patience with someone in work, that's going to have a detrimental effect on that person and the whole working environment. It's the same thing in the home environment, and we don't always necessarily recognize that. So looking at this cognitive cycle in the eyes of your child, they might have this thought of, I can't do this, I'm no good at this, and is probably very, very common in those children with ADHD. Those corresponding feelings with a thought of I can't do this might be frustration or helplessness, and that will turn into a behavior of either disconnect or avoiding wanting to do things, or potentially acting out. So that can come in quite negative behaviors. Looking at continuing that cognitive cycle, we can actually break this cycle if we are aware of what is happening. So with those thoughts, and we're looking through the lens of an adult right at the moment, is how else could I see this situation? And then if I'm breaking that thought cycle with, oh, look what's in front of me, they've made a mess, it's going to cost thousands of pounds to fix, the plumber is supposed to be coming around, thank goodness he is. But all of these thoughts, I'm going to get very cross with my child. And you might yell and scream and panic and all of these things. So these kind of thoughts are driving those behaviors and those feelings. But we can also break those feelings by looking at kind of gratitude or compassion. So actually seeing that child thinking they just wanted to help. And I left the room for 20 minutes trying to sort out another problem, and I've walked into this. So I have to take some sort of responsibility for this problem that's been created. But it's not my fault, it's not their fault. So it's a chance of gratitude and compassion. And that compassion might be, wow, he was really, really eager to go out and spend time with me. And my behaviors might be, I might add a pause in there rather than flying off the handle. Now, the situation that I was in, we didn't go out that afternoon because I was so fuming that the consequence was, well, what's the point? And obviously my response then triggered his response to, I was just trying to help and now the whole world's fallen apart and I am no good and this and that and the other. None of us are immune to these natural kind of responses. Obviously we did make up and it was great. We went out the next day. But just being aware of and understanding what is happening within us and potentially what we could do differently, that's what we're going to go in and talk about today. So there's this fantastic theory from Jill Bolte Taylor, Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, and she wrote a book called A Stroke of Insight after she had suffered quite a serious stroke and she was quite young. She's got a fantastic TED talk, but doesn't necessarily talk about the 90-second rule in that, but is still definitely worth looking into. But she came up with this concept of the 90-second rule. She is a neuroscientist, and she discovered and made people aware that we do have a chemical response, natural chemical response in us that has a peak and then dissipates. So that if you imagine that's your adrenaline and your cortisol and all these hormones getting you ready for what we call fight, flight, freeze. And that is the natural response. This 90 seconds basically is the time that chemical is reactive in your body, less than 90 seconds. And just to demonstrate what I mean by that, if you imagine a deer is in a forest and grazing happily and it hears a bang, it will often freeze, so it's fight, flight, freeze, and then run. And it'll run. But the extraordinary thing about that deer is if you see it less than 90 seconds later, it will be grazing quite happily in another field. So it's just to show how that cycle works. Now, I know that probably most of you listening to this is saying, but my child has been in complete hysterics for 2 days, and that is not a 90-second response. And I get this. So what is happening there is humans, fortunately or unfortunately, have a cognitive process which is called the mind. And we think. And we think and we feel. And all of those thoughts and feelings can keep this 90-second cycle happening over and over and over again. And we can see it happen with things that have happened in the past. So we ruminate on something, we bring up this thought, and we're feeling as awful as we might have felt a couple of years ago. And sometimes we don't even recognize the thought that is coming out. So it might manifest in a panic attack that's come from nowhere, or a depression or a low mood, and you're thinking, I have no idea why this is happening, because the mind and the thoughts and all of that is happening independently from you. So it's a lack of self-awareness in that process. So how do we break this cycle? So those of you who are new to today, just a little bit about me. My name is Zena Hicks. I'm a positive psychologist, also a leadership coach and a parent mentor. And I came across positive psychology a number of years ago, many, many years ago, when my son, my eldest, was quite young, because I could see markers in him that were very like my brother, who had quite severe mental health issues all through his childhood and his adulthood. And what I liked about positive psychology was that it looks at what's right with people. And quite often, and I didn't actually discover this until later, with ADHD, which my two sons have, but they present very differently. And then I subsequently was told that I had it and I got diagnosed for it. But with ADHD, often these children, and if you joined last week, is they're hearing constantly all these negatives. They're hearing constantly that there's something wrong with them. And when we put them in therapy, which is sometimes the absolute right thing to do, they're again focusing on what's wrong. And what we're trying to do with positive psychology is start to look at what's right. So playing on strengths, building on not what's wrong, because actually often there's not a lot wrong or nothing wrong. They're the same as anybody else, but they just need a different type of nurturing. So going back to this, how we are going to break this cycle. We need to get into the mindset of where we're going to break the cycle and how we're going to break the cycle. And I've already mentioned about how else can I see this? How can I feel this compassion and gratitude? And how do I choose to respond? And I'm completely aware that sometimes being in the zone to do this is extremely hard. So I'm not lessening the ease at which it's been done, but it can be done. I not only know this personally, but also through working with a lot of people. I have to say my natural state is one of more anxiety than calm, but I do manage to level that out. And I'm going to share a story where I didn't actually just this morning. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to do this session about how not to lose it with your child. And here I am yelling at my 18-year-old. And I will go into that in a minute. And I did basically, it didn't do any of these. Well, I did, and I'll share that in a minute. So what we can do is look at reframing these thoughts and just taking that little thoughts bubble. So not worrying about the feelings or the behaviors for now, but just reframing the thought. What could we do differently? So if in a situation where we are presented with something that is going to wind us up, allowing ourselves to have that pause, and I'll share as well how we might be able to do that in a minute. These are just some questions you potentially could ask yourself. So what have I done to contribute? So if you think about that episode in the kitchen with the spanner and the plumber, I left the room. I left the room for 20 minutes to go and deal with a call, and my child was bored and wanted to go out, and he was trying to be helpful. So I contributed to that. Do I know why this happened? Well, yeah, because well, at the time I didn't. I just saw the behavior. I saw the fallout from that. But asking these questions, why, and often I've noticed and I'm aware that when children display behaviors, whether they're diagnosed with ADHD or not, or have just had a bad day, all you're seeing is the behavior, the end result. You're not hearing or seeing anything that's happened before that. And often when we ask questions, why did you do this? Actually, they don't know why. And the question, why did you do this, will throw them into a spiral because they're trying to protect themselves. So fight, flight, freeze. So they'll have gone into that cycle, which will stop them being able to express themselves. Then also the question of what else is going on for them and for me. So for me, I had a stressful situation, I had to answer that call. For them, they just wanted to go out. So, and it could be that so this morning, I yelled at my 18-year-old son because I came back and we were supposed to leave for school, and it took him half an hour to get out of the house. And I was thinking, what's going on for me is I had a call to go to. So that was influencing my response to him. And I was just kind of almost watching how I was behaving internally with him. And I chose to continue the behavior with him. But it was very, very interesting. The question I didn't ask is, what are my objectives, and does this benefit me, them, or both? Now, what ended up happening is I drove him all the way to school rather than the bus stop, and that didn't benefit me because it made me later. So had I not yelled in the beginning, that wouldn't have flustered him, which could have got his boss, and then I wouldn't have been late. So watching the impact of our own reactions to somebody else's behaviors is really, really key. And it can happen in school environments as well, where you are only seeing what you see in front of you and you don't know the rest. So broadly speaking, questions, asking yourself a question, and not why do they do this, but what can I learn from this? and what is going on for them. Why might they have done this? What have I got to contribute to? And also, what if I did nothing? If I walked away and then considered it for a minute and then came back in and discussed it. So this is just kind of one way of breaking that cycle. So there's a lovely acronym called Respond with Care. So if you are kind of thinking about how can I respond to this child who I love, my objective is to nurture them and care for them and do everything for them. And by yelling at them, that is actually going against all my values, but it is my natural response. So it's about care. I care for this person, so I'm going to stay calm and I'm going to stay centered. And that might be by looking after your own self-care. So you know that you can take a deep breath and recenter yourself. And then also acknowledging that, yeah, I've got a 90-second chemical response. So there is going to be a peak where I'm going to want to fight, flight, or freeze. And sometimes we fight, and that's why we yell. And how, this is happening in me, and I know it is, and it's going to go away. So if I kind of breathe myself through this 90 seconds or just pause for a minute and just watch what's happening, that will give me enough time to reflect and consider the different perspectives. What's happening with them? What's happening with me? Why might this have happened? Are they bored? Have I not given them much attention lately? What is it? And then to engage. So then we're looking at engaging in a mindful, considered response, and one that we feel is right for our own personal values, which is to care, love, and nurture this human being. And also recognizing that they may not get that same response outside of your family environment. So everything you can give them within that family environment is a huge bonus. So looking at controlling that cycle, how else can I see this? Thoughts is knowledge. So what do we know? And that might be, what do we know about ADHD? What do we know about the symptoms? How much control do they have? How much control do I have? What influence do I have? So the knowledge is really important, that we gather that knowledge, and I'm hoping these sessions will help with that. And then self-care. So what am I doing to show up in the best way? And we often, parents, forget and neglect this bit. And we're seeing this bad behavior and or poor response over and over and over again. And that's feeding our automatic response system. So we're constantly influenced by our downloaded program. And especially as our children get a little bit older. So my eldest is now 18, and I've got a lot of years of him behaving and reacting in a certain way that influences the way I speak to him sometimes. And, it's just trying to be aware of that. So this morning, he actually asked me after I yelled at him, are you okay? And I go, fine. And the reason why he was asking me, am I okay? Because I can usually keep my cool. But thinking about what I hadn't done. So I haven't meditated for 2 days. I haven't gone swimming, and I usually go swimming every weekday. Haven't gone swimming in 2 days. So I have to take responsibility that if I'm not going to look after myself, I am going to be less present and less able to look after and nurture those around me. And it's like that oxygen mask that comes out in a plane. The parents need to look after themselves first before tending to the children. So that was my lesson from today. I need to go back, meditate, and go back swimming tomorrow morning. Self-care is so crucially important. And then you've got the strategies. So the behavior is our strategies. What strategies do we have to use in these times? I hope that's kind of helped. I know we could go into so much more depth, but I hope that's given you a little bit of insight. Please do let me know in the chat any takeaway that you've had from that. If there's something you hadn't heard before, or maybe you have heard this before and you just wanted to kind of a short reminder, and that was really great. Next week, we will look at 5 positive reinforcement tips that actually work with children with ADHD traits. And we're looking at those strengths-based pieces that we've mentioned before. So just opening it up to questions. And I'll just come off this share so we can have a chat.